Good morning everyone. Today's Bible reading is from 2 Samuel chapter 11. If you've got a church Bible, there are some around the edges of church. Do grab one if you want to. It's on page 314. So the story of David and Bathsheba. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, "I am pregnant." So David sent this word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent him to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and did not go down to his house. David was told Uriah did not go home. So he asked Uriah, "Haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." Then David said to him, "Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it, he wrote, "Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him, so he will be struck down and die." So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. Joab sent David a full account of the battle. He instructed the messenger, "When you have finished giving the king this account of the battle, the king's anger may flare up, and he may ask you, 'Why did you get so close to the city to fight? Didn't you know they would shoot arrows from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerub-Besheth? Didn't a woman drop an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died in Tebez? Why did you get so close to the wall?' If he asks you this, then say to him, 'Moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead.'" The messenger set out, and when he had arrived, he told David everything Joab had sent him to say. The messenger said to David, "The men overpowered us and came out against us in the open, but we drove them back to the entrance of the city gates. Then the archers shot arrows at your servants from the wall, and some of the king's men died. Moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead." David told the messenger, "Say this to Joab, 'Don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. Press the attacks against the city and destroy it. Say this to encourage Joab.'" When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. This is the word of the Lord.
Oh, thank you, Will. If you were paying attention to that, you'll realize that today's topic is a rather unpleasant one, a bit sordid, a bit terrible, dealing with everything from coveting your neighbor's wife to adultery to bearing false witness to murder. And it reminded me when we were singing, led by Ben and the band. That's a good name, isn't it? Ben and the band. We'll use that. He was singing, "I give it all to you, Lord, trusting that you'll make something beautiful out of me." And we need to remember that we give it all the sin, all the bad, all the regret. We give it all to him, trusting that God will redeem us and make something beautiful. So, we've been following the story of David for quite some time now. And yet, if you recall from the last week's sermon, we've made a very big leap in time. So we just need to give a little summary of what's happened in the interim. When we left off, David had rescued his two wives, Abigail and Ahinoam, and all the captives of the Amalekites in a daring and brazen raid and rescue mission. He'd been working for the Philistines, believe it or not, because King Saul had sent him away. But then the Philistines sent him away because he might have been a spy. So in chapter 31, the last chapter of 1 Samuel, we read that at long last, Saul, David's thorn in the flesh, falls on his sword and kills himself to avoid being taken alive by the Philistines. And you would think, wow, now it's David's turn to shine. But no, there are 10 more chapters before we get to this chapter 11. And during those 10 chapters, we discover that although David is anointed king in Horeb, that's in the southern part, and the southern tribe of Judah respected that, but all the northern tribes didn't. And they continued to recognize the house of Saul. And there was a civil war for 7.5 years between the house of Saul and the house of David. And it was a terrible affair. There were several murders, there were plots, there was connivings and betrayals amongst the leaders and rival forces, some quite gruesome and sordid happenings, until finally David's house is victorious, and all Israel agrees to unite and to recognize David as king. And then he reigns from that time 33 more years. But at that time, at the beginning of that time, he was only 30 years old. So by now, he's maybe 37, mid-30s, somewhere a bit later. And a lot of things have happened. What things? Well, David manages to capture Jerusalem. And then he takes on several more wives and concubines. Not sure how God felt about that. Meanwhile, the Philistines are moving about and taking more and more territory. And so David inquires of the Lord, which was the right thing to do. He says, "Should I attack the Philistines?" And the Lord says, "Go, for I will surely hand over the Philistines to you." And David then brings the Ark of the Covenant. He captures it from Kiriath Jearim, and he brings it up to Jerusalem. And all the way he dances before the Lord, praising God in public in the linen ephod, and that causes great shame to Michal, Saul's daughter, and all that goes on. But then God blesses David, and he defeats the Philistines, he defeats the Moabites, and God then promises to David that he will build David's house and establish it forever as the ruling house of Israel, to establish his throne as an eternal throne. Wow, that's heady stuff, right? So David defeats all these other small kingdoms. He becomes famous. He becomes a celebrity. The power is rising in Israel. And that's when the trouble begins. You've heard the statement, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. I'm sure there was adultery being committed all over the place by all these armies and, all sorts of things. We don't hear anything about that. But with David, David had a special place in God's purposes for Israel. And God had worked with David and we've seen over the many weeks that we've studied his life how God had intervened and rescued him and anointed him and trained and raised him up through trials and tribulations. So let me give a summary. We have a man from humble origins, gifted by God, who does great things in honor of God's name. He has some ups and downs, trials and tribulations, but God molds and shapes his character. Until gradually, everything begins going his way. He becomes a great writer, producing works that all God's people love and admire. He lives a life that seems to rise further and further into the upper echelons of honor, esteem, and good works. And he becomes famous, a celebrity. The world is his oyster. But then, for seemingly inexplicable reasons, he falls into temptation and commits adultery. He tries to cover it up with increasingly complicated efforts until finally he's caught out. But instead of doubling down and justifying himself and making excuses, he repents before God. And God hears him. But nevertheless, there are grave consequences. Now, who am I talking about here? David, you think, of course. I actually wrote this about Philip Yancey. Now think about that for a moment. Philip Yancey, the highly esteemed Christian writer who a few weeks ago, many of you will know, came out with a confession that he had been in a long-term adulterous relationship years ago, and he confessed the whole thing. He repented, no caveats, no excuses, and he resigned from all further ministry roles. And yet, I'm comparing the two for a particular reason, because Philip Yancey fell from grace, according to the reports. And he confessed to all this, and all of his wonderful, amazing books are now being condemned. What a tragedy. Fall from grace. And Christians are saying we shouldn't read or promote his books anymore. Now, what's my point? Adultery is a serious sin, indeed. But when the Pharisees brought a woman who was charged with adultery before Jesus and asked him what should be done, should she be stoned, Jesus, strangely enough, seemed more concerned with something else. And he began writing in the dust. He was more concerned with their own hypocrisy. And he said, you who are without sin, cast the first stone. And this idea of hypocrisy, and we know that all of them realized what he had written, probably a prophecy from Jeremiah saying exactly that same thing. And they knew that they were as guilty as this woman. And so they left. And Jesus doesn't condemn her. He says, go and sin no more. So we stand in judgment of Philip Yancey, and we want to throw him down from his pedestal because he's a Christian leader, and we do this to many of our leaders. And we see it time and time again. Leaders fail. Our leaders fail leaders in the church, leaders in Christian life, in politics, and other places. And they fail, and we want to throw them to the wolves, even though, as everyone who has ever been to primary school knows, when you point the finger at someone, there are 3 fingers pointing back at you, right? All right, let's compare David and Philip just for a moment longer. Both were raised up by God to an extraordinary ministry. Both wrote incredible works that have benefited and transformed God's people over a 40-year, 50-year time span. David wrote over 73 Psalms. Yancey has written nearly 70 books and countless articles. Both committed adultery. And yet today, we honor David as Israel's greatest king, a man after God's own heart. We extol him as a great leader, and we treasure the Psalms. Whereas I've been reading articles condemning Yancey, suggesting that Christians should no longer read his books, they should be banned, that he is no longer considered a trustworthy mentor of our Christian lives and discipleship. Well, hang on. We're right to be disappointed and to recognize the extent of his failings. But in my view, we ought to be very careful about condemning and judging others. Because we're not given that role to be the judge of others. That is God's role, lest you be judged. Judge not, lest you be judged. And whenever we point the finger, as I said, 3 fingers are pointing back at us. So let's be cautious in how we respond to these kinds of accusations. Now, David committed adultery, yes. Does that invalidate the Psalms? Yancey committed adultery. Should that invalidate all his work or all he's written in service of God's kingdom? Well, this is meant to be a sermon about David, not about Philip Yancey. So I'm just trying to highlight, really, what is our response? What is our response to other people's sin? What is our response to our own sin? Are we consistent in our response to others' sin? Are we consistent in our own? Are we too easily hypocritical or accusatory when we are all flawed and in need of God's grace and forgiveness? And sometimes it's the opposite. We easily forgive others, but we don't learn to forgive ourselves, even when God does. Now, I'm not trying to dismiss this sin as unimportant, far from it. But let's look back at David's story to see how God responds and how David was restored. So, in the context, this is really a fascinating story. All this time that's gone by, David's been rising from a very troubled period in his life to a higher state until he is now really living the life of the king of Israel, unified the kingdom, everything's going his way. So it starts out saying, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab. David didn't go. He stayed at home in his palace. And we might think, well, was he now just being lazy and tired, and he had other people to do all his dirty work, and was he just now wanting to live a comfortable life? Maybe, we don't know. I think it's more likely that David was a warrior. He wanted to be out there. He wanted to be out leading the troops, but all his advisors saw him now as too valuable. He was the king. He had to be protected. He didn't need to be out fighting these small battles here and there, putting his life at risk. So there he is, left at home at the palace. And to make matters worse, the battles they were fighting were actually personal battles to him. He was very upset by what had happened. I'll read you the backstory here from chapter 10. The king of the Ammonites died, and his son Hanun succeeded him as king. David thought, I will show kindness to Hanun, son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me. So David sent a delegation to express his sympathy to Hanun concerning his father. And when David's men came to the land of the Ammonites, the nobles said to Hanun their lord, "Do you think David is honoring your father by sending men here to express sympathy? Hasn't David sent them to you to explore the city and to spy it out and to overthrow it?" So Hanun seized David's men, shaved off half of each man's beard, cut off their garments in the middle at the buttocks, and sent them away. Now, imagine, this is the most humiliating thing a person could do to a delegation in those days. Beards were very important. And to shave off someone's beard was a sign of total humiliation. To shave off half the beard was like doubly as bad. What can you do with half a beard? It's awful. And then to cut off the garments halfway at the buttocks and making the walk home virtually naked. I mean, this was terrible. David, we know, had quite a fiery temper. He is angry. He wants revenge. And they're saying, "You stay home at the palace." So there he is, bored, frustrated, angry, all alone. And what's he do? Well, those are the times in our lives when temptation gets the better of us. When we're bored, when we're frustrated, when we're angry, when we're not seeking the Lord and following his purposes. And this is exactly what happens to David. So let's take a look now at Bathsheba. She is an enigma. And there are two very different perspectives we could take on Bathsheba. We know that she's out there bathing on the roof of her home, and in the Middle East, homes had flat roofs, and that was a natural thing. Often there were shades, and people would eat and have meals and escape the heat from below in the breeze. So that was a common thing. Now, one perspective is that here she is, a young woman just minding her own business on her own property, and some lecherous old man gazes down at her in lust and desires her, and because he has all the power and she has no power, he takes advantage of her. And that's one perspective. Another perspective is that she knew full well that she was in view of the king's palace, maybe of other houses as well, and she was nevertheless bathing in public. Perhaps she was even trying to attract the gaze of the king. Why not? Was she happily married to Uriah the Hittite? Or, as most marriages would have been, was it arranged marriage to some foreigner, a Hittite, who she despised? We don't know. Perhaps she saw this as an opportunity. Maybe if I can get the king's attention, I can get out of my situation, and it's my opportunity for fame and celebrity status if he notices me. We don't know. But it's very interesting that all we learn from this story, and it just doesn't give us many details, is that is simply that there was no sign of any resistance, any questioning, any protest. All it says is David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. That's all we get. No explanation. Was she forced? Did she have a choice? After all, he was the king. Was he abusing his power? It sounds a little bit more like she put up no protest. She went willingly. She slept with the king. Who wouldn't? I mean, David was he's in his mid-30s. He's a handsome man. He's got all the power and glory to offer. What a great opportunity. All we know is that she had purified herself from her monthly time so that we know that she was not already pregnant. Therefore, the next thing we hear is she conceives, and she sends word to David saying, "I am pregnant." Nothing else, just, "I am pregnant." Wonder what the king will do. So, a few weeks ago, I spoke about Abigail. And here we have a really interesting comparison, because Abigail was a woman who was married to someone who David was coming to kill in revenge. He was, hot-headed, and rightfully so. Nabal probably deserved it. But Abigail, she takes action. She goes out, she gathers her resources. She goes out to meet David at great personal peril. She might have been killed. And she stops him, not on behalf of Nabal, but on behalf of him, because she recognized that he was the representative of God. He was the king of Israel. And she said, do not do this thing, because you will have blood guilt on your hands. And so she saved, David listened to her, and she stopped him from doing a terrible thing. We get none of that with Bathsheba. So I don't know. Interesting comparison, though. Esther is another one who took a stand at great personal peril. So women did have a voice, although, very differently in those days. Took some courage. Now, Uriah, the third person in this story, Uriah is the only one who acts with integrity. And David sends him back to wash his feet. Well, what does that mean? In this context, it means go home and relax. Just, wash your feet, relax. And David sends him a gift. And that gift, in the Hebrew, is a gift of food. It was a royal meal. It was so that Uriah could enjoy a lovely, luxurious night at home with his wife. And therefore, when the pregnancy was discovered, David would be absolved of guilt. Okay? He could get away clean. But Uriah doesn't go for it because he feels this is wrong, because all of his comrades are sacrificing themselves out on the battlefield. How could he possibly go and have a luxurious night, make love to his wife, and do all that when he shouldn't even be there at all? He should be on the battlefield with them. So he sleeps on a mat at the front of the palace gate. So David tries again, gets him drunk, and thinks maybe it'll work the second time. Still doesn't work. Uriah refuses. And so David says, well, okay, send him back to the battlefield. I've got to cover my tracks somehow. I'll do away with Uriah. And so he gives this plot, sends it to Joab, put Uriah at the front lines where it's most dangerous, and hopefully he'll be killed. And his plan works. And Uriah is killed. And David gets away with it, scot-free, right? Well, all we know from this chapter is it ends with these words, but the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Well, yeah, it sounds like a bit of a slap on the wrist, doesn't it? The thing David had done displeased the Lord. But hang on a minute. I don't want to go into the next chapter, but we know the rest of the story. Nathan confronts David as a prophet. David suddenly is aware of his own sin. He gets so angry with what Nathan is telling him, finally realizes it's about himself. And what has he done? He recognizes that not only has he committed adultery, but he broke the commandment of thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. He broke the commandment of not to commit adultery. He broke the commandment of thou shalt not murder, because he was blamed for Uriah's murder. And many other scholars will say a fourth commandment of bearing false witness against his neighbor. So David is very, very guilty. And David is in a prestigious position. God has raised him up as the leader, as God's representative in Israel. So this is a very serious sin in God's eyes. And what does God do? God is the judge, not anyone else. And although God listens to David and says, I will not remove you, you will be restored, but because of the murder, the Lord says, the sword shall never depart from your house. And David was fighting civil wars for the rest of his life. And because of the adultery and the coveting, he said, your own wives and concubines will be taken and abused by someone within your own house. And that happened with Absalom, who did that publicly to shame David. And because of the bearing false witness, the Lord said, and your son will die. And although David fasted and prayed for 7 days, his son died. Now, just another little comparison between Abigail and Bathsheba. Bathsheba's second son with David was Solomon. Abigail's son with David was Chileab, whom we know nothing about, went off into obscurity. Solomon became the next king. Was that a blessing or a curse? Very difficult to say. Now, having looked at all this, this was a terrible, sordid affair. Did anything good come out of this? Did anything good come out of it? Well, yes, something amazingly wonderful came out of this. David wrote Psalm 51 on the basis of this experience. And I'd like to just read parts of this to you as a kind of a prayer to end. And if the band would like to come up now, that'd be good. So listen to these words as a sort of prayer and think about our response to sin with others, but also our response to our own sin in our own lives. And David writes, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgression. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions and my sin is always before me. Cleanse me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Hide your face from my sins and blot out all my iniquity. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me from your presence, or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me." Amen.